In 1944, at the port of Alexandria in Egypt, British officers were checking the papers of Polish soldiers boarding a transport ship for the war in Italy. Every man needed a name, a rank, and a serial number. No exceptions, and absolutely no pets or mascots allowed on board. So when the 22nd Artillery Supply Company reached the gangway, their paperwork was in perfect order. Name, Wojtek. Rank, private. Serial number, assigned. Paybook, issued. The private in question weighed around 200 pounds, was still growing, and was a Syrian brown bear. This is not a legend, and it is not a mascot story that grew in the telling, though we will get to the parts people still argue about. Private Wojtek of the Polish Second Corps would go on to carry live artillery shells through one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War, earn a promotion to corporal, and retire, like many of his human comrades, to Scotland. This is the true story of the soldier bear. To understand how a bear ends up with a Polish army paybook, you first have to understand why the Polish army was walking through the mountains of Iran in the first place. In 1939, Poland was invaded from both sides, by Germany in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were deported to Soviet labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia, where cold, hunger, and brutal work killed enormous numbers of them. Then, in 1941, Germany turned on the Soviet Union, and Moscow suddenly needed every ally it could find. The surviving Polish prisoners were released and allowed to form an army under General Władysław Anders. Tens of thousands of gaunt, exhausted soldiers and civilians made their way south out of the Soviet Union, through Persia, toward British-controlled territory in the Middle East. They had lost their homes, their families, and their country. And it was on that road, in the spring of 1942, that they found a bear. Near the town of Hamadan, in the mountains of Iran, a group of these Polish soldiers came across a local shepherd boy carrying a squirming sack. Inside was a Syrian brown bear cub, just a few weeks old, so young his eyes had barely opened. Hunters had shot his mother, and the boy had found him alone in a cave. The soldiers, men who had just lost everything they had ever had, took one look at this orphan and made a deal on the spot. The price, according to the men who were there, was a Swiss Army knife, a tin of beef, a chocolate bar, and a little money. The cub was too young to eat solid food, so the soldiers fed him condensed milk from an old vodka bottle with a rag twisted into a teat. He slept inside their tents, usually curled up against someone's chest for warmth. They named him Wojtek, an old Polish name that means, roughly, happy warrior. Wojtek grew, and grew, and grew, and because he had been raised by soldiers from the day his eyes opened, he genuinely seemed to believe he was one of them. He was formally adopted by the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, and he copied everything the men did. When they marched, he shuffled along upright beside them. When they raised a hand in greeting, he raised a paw. He learned to ride in the passenger seat of the supply trucks, one enormous arm hanging out the window, terrifying unsuspecting drivers coming the other way. His favorite reward was a bottle of beer, which he learned to hold and drink himself, peering into the empty bottle afterwards as if asking where the rest had gone. Cigarettes he did not really smoke. The men would light one for him, he would take a puff or two, and then he would simply eat it. Wrestling matches with the soldiers were a daily event, and to his credit, he learned to be gentle. Mostly. Of all the human habits Wojtek picked up, his favorite was the shower. He had learned how the bathhouse worked, and in the desert heat of the Middle East, he developed a habit of sneaking in and draining the camp's carefully rationed water while standing blissfully under the spray. He got scolded for it constantly. It never stopped him. And then, one day in Palestine in 1943, the habit paid off. Wojtek ambled into the bathhouse for an illicit shower and came face to face with a stranger hiding inside, a man who, according to the unit's account, had slipped into the camp to scout its ammunition stores. The intruder was so terrified at being cornered by a full-grown brown bear that he surrendered on the spot, and the camp had its most unusual security arrest of the war. Now, this story comes from Wojtek's comrades rather than from any surviving arrest report, so take the details with a grain of salt. But the men of the 22nd told it for the rest of their lives, and Wojtek, they said, was rewarded with extra beer. By early 1944, the Polish Second Corps was ordered to Italy, where some of the hardest fighting of the war was waiting. The 22nd Company would sail from Egypt, and that is where the paperwork problem appeared. British transport regulations were clear. Soldiers boarded ships. Pets and mascots did not. There was no box on any form for a bear, and the men flatly refused to leave him behind. So the company found the loophole hiding in plain sight. If pets could not board, then Wojtek could simply stop being a pet. He was officially drafted into the Polish army as a private, with his own paybook, his own rank, his own serial number, and his own ration allowance, which, for the record, he considered inadequate. The argument that won over the authorities was that he was essential to morale, which by all accounts was simply true. And so, in the spring of 1944, Private Wojtek walked up the gangway and sailed for Italy as a soldier. The place they were sailing toward was Monte Cassino, and it is hard to overstate how grim that name sounded in 1944. A mountain topped by a ruined medieval monastery, it dominated the main road to Rome, and German forces dug into its slopes had already thrown back 3 full Allied assaults over 5 brutal months. Soldiers from a dozen nations had bled on that mountain through the winter and into the spring. In May 1944, the fourth attempt was launched, and the task of taking the monastery hill itself fell to the Polish Second Corps, the same army of former prisoners that had walked out of the Soviet Union 2 years earlier. The fighting was savage, often at close quarters among rocks and ruins, and it burned through ammunition at a staggering rate. Keeping the guns fed meant an endless chain of men hauling heavy crates of shells to the artillery positions, hour after hour, day and night. And that was the job of Wojtek's company. This is where Wojtek stepped out of the mascot business and into military history. During the battle, with the guns roaring and men rushing crates of 25-pounder shells from the supply trucks, witnesses said Wojtek watched the loading line, walked over, stood up on his hind legs, and held out his front paws. A bear can carry what 4 men can carry, and according to the men of the 22nd, that is exactly what he did, hauling 100-pound crates of live artillery shells, again and again, throughout the battle, and never dropping a single one. Now, honesty time. Every account of this comes from the soldiers themselves, and historians still debate how much carrying he actually did, one story or many, a few crates or a steady shift. But we know his unit was there, we know the accounts began immediately, not decades later, and we know what his comrades did next, which is perhaps the strongest evidence of all. On May 18, 1944, a Polish flag flew over the ruins of Monte Cassino. After the battle, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company did something that tells you everything about what Wojtek meant to them. They redesigned their official military emblem. From that point on, the badge of the company was a bear, walking upright, carrying an artillery shell. It was approved up the chain of command, painted on the doors of their trucks, and worn on the sleeves of their uniforms for the rest of the war. Think about that for a moment. A formal military unit of the Polish armed forces spent the rest of the Second World War operating under the insignia of their bear. Wojtek himself was promoted to corporal, which meant, among other things, that he now technically outranked some of the men who had bought him as a cub for a chocolate bar. He served through the rest of the Italian campaign as the company moved north, by now less a mascot than a minor celebrity across the entire Eighth Army. Then the war ended, and for the Poles of the Second Corps, victory tasted like ash. The Allied powers had agreed at Yalta that Poland would fall within the Soviet sphere, and the country these men had fought 6 years to free was now run by a communist government installed by the same power that had once shipped them to Siberia. For many of Anders' soldiers, going home meant risking arrest, or worse. Most chose exile. In 1946, the 22nd Company was transferred to Scotland to be demobilized, and Wojtek came with them, arriving at Winfield Camp in Berwickshire like any other soldier of the unit. The Scottish boarders took to him instantly. He became a fixture at local dances and village events, children adored him, and he roamed the camp as its most famous resident. But demobilization meant the army that had been his entire family since he was a cub was, one man at a time, being dissolved. On the 15th of November, 1947, Corporal Wojtek was formally demobilized, and his comrades made the hardest decision of his story. A 500-pound brown bear cannot live in a boarding house with an exiled soldier, and so Wojtek was given to Edinburgh Zoo. By every account, the first stretch was hard. He had never lived apart from his men, and keepers reportedly went as far as putting on uniform jackets and learning a few words of Polish to comfort him. And for years afterwards, his old comrades came. Former soldiers of the Second Corps, scattered across Britain in exile, would stand at the enclosure and call to him in Polish, and Wojtek would perk up and amble over to the men he knew. Some tossed him cigarettes, for old time's sake, and in the early days more than one veteran simply climbed in to wrestle with him, to the alarm of zoo staff and the total indifference of the bear. He remained the zoo's most famous resident for the rest of his life. Wojtek died at Edinburgh Zoo on the 2nd of December, 1963, around 22 years old, over 6 feet tall on his hind legs and close to 500 pounds. The obituaries ran in newspapers across Britain, which is not a sentence you get to say about many zoo animals. And remarkably, his fame has only grown since. There is a bronze statue of Wojtek and a Polish soldier walking side by side in Prince's Street Gardens in Edinburgh, unveiled in 2015. There are statues and memorials in Krakow, in Zagan, in the Scottish borders, and a plaque at the zoo itself. There have been books, documentaries, and films. For the Polish exile community, he became something more than a curiosity. He is a way of telling the story of Anders' army, the deportations, the impossible journey out of Siberia, and the soldiers who won a war and lost their homeland, through the one member of the unit everyone instantly loves. So that is the story of Wojtek, the soldier bear. A cub orphaned in the mountains of Iran, raised on condensed milk by men who had lost everything, enlisted through a loophole, carried live shells across the slopes of Monte Cassino, and retired to Scotland with the rest of his unit. The men of the 22nd could have told you exactly why they kept him fed, ranked, and paid. In an army of exiles, thousands of miles from a home that no longer existed, Wojtek was the one comrade who made every camp feel like a place worth being. History's strangest soldier, and quite possibly its most loved. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe, because there is a new strange, true piece of history here every single day.